Join us this evening to address the debate entitled A Future Fair for All. Now, this being radio as opposed to the written word, you'll have to rely upon my intonation to realise that that's in fact a question rather than a statement. A future fair for all, perhaps, will make it clearer what it is we're embarked upon. What exactly do we mean by fairness?
At the heart of fairness is this notion of due desert. Every society in history and across civilizations measures justice by having a tariff, scales, in which you calibrate the punishment for the intensity of the bad action. And exactly the same way we human beings calibrate reward for the good thing or the degree of the good thing we've done. Then there's the impact of good luck and bad luck. We want to share in people's good luck that they've done nothing to deserve, which is one of the reasons why there's such a strong case for inheritance tax. And we want to mitigate people's bad luck, which is why we have a national health service. It's so we share in each other's brute bad luck. And lastly, there's got to be a process, either a competitive market or a democracy or a fair tribunal or a court of law, which duly and impartially examines what's gone on. We want a voice, we human beings, whether we think a decision that's been arrived at is fair. All that constitutes fairness.
And do we exist currently in a society that fits this description of fairness?
No, we don't. There's a lot of people who are rich who've got their money, in my view, in an undeserving way. I don't think we work hard enough to do something about the really terrible circumstances in which many people get born into, in which they have nothing, can do nothing about. It's just brute bad luck if you are born in a part of Britain where it's really hard to break out of it, whatever you do, however hard you try. And we don't do enough to mitigate that. And we don't do enough, actually, to share in the amazing good luck of people who inherit vast sums of money.
Fairness is a great concept, great abstract concept for when you're playing a game, and it's pretty useful in a court of law. But if you're going to use it for running public policy, for deciding public policy, it is just one of a number of factors that you might want to take into account. For example, you might think it unfair that perhaps there's somebody who owns a big house in Belgravia with lots of bedrooms which he doesn't use, and somebody else has got 3 children in a small bedroom in a place that's damp and horrible. And you may think, wouldn't it be fair for everybody to have the same amount of housing, exactly the same quantity per person? That's what they thought in communist Russia, obviously. And the 20th century was an object lesson of the fact that communism does not work. And if you take a concept too far, then you can have not just trouble, you can have disaster. And there are complex things here in public policy, and fairness is just one of them.
You're quite right. If you take things too far, you have disaster. But if you don't take them anywhere at all, you're left surely with comparable tragedy. And I wonder whether you're exaggerating the difference.
One of the reasons why the concept of fairness is being used so much by politicians at the moment is because it is so woolly, because we don't really know when people refer to it whether they mean equality or just a bit of equality, a little nudge in that direction. And it's because it's vagueness, it's so useful to politicians. They sound nice. I believe in fairness, I'm against unfairness. It's just something that sounds useful, but it doesn't commit them to a single thing. It is not a policy, and underneath that, they can believe anything.
You need to think about what fairness is and why we should care about it anyway. Do we care about it for itself intrinsically, or do we care about it because we think it serves as a means to a further end, such as reducing the deficit or raising the position of the worst off? In terms of what it is, I would argue that it's attributing to each his or her due, and there'll be 3 sets of philosophical questions that arise from that. Who comes under the each? Do we include, for instance, future generations or embryos or even non-human animals? But beneath all of it, and philosophers are going to have widely different answers to all those groups of questions, but beneath all of them, if you have a concept of fairness, you have a notion of individuals as separate persons. That means if you are committed to fairness, you can't just see people as a number which can be added up into a bigger number. I would argue that each human is of equal worth and as such deserves an equal portion of something such as rights. And that we all also deserve equal access to certain goods which will then be proportionally distributed according to need or merit, but absolutely equal allocation of certain basic things such as human rights.
I slightly disagree with that. Can I come in?
Of course, Will Hutton.
I just think that we've got to be very careful in this debate not to muddle up fairness with equality. Yes, human beings are of equal worth, but the point about fairness is that we are not talking about equality of outcome. We're talking about some relationship between what you put in and what you get out. And the harder you work, the fairer it is that you get more out. There is a relationship, it's a proportional relationship.
I just want to make three very specific points. The first is that we do have choices. James tried to imply to you, I think, he tried to pull the wool over your eyes and say to you that really there's no point in intervening. Fairness is too difficult, it's too complicated, leave it alone. That's simply not the case. Look at Sweden and look at the United States. They're both economically successful countries, or they were until recently, in America's case. But they've chosen drastically different routes in terms of social justice. So you can be an economically successful country that chooses to be reasonably fair, like Sweden, or you can be an economically dynamic country that accepts very high levels of inequality, as is America. And I think, broadly speaking, you can divide the people of Britain into people who would rather be a bit more Scandinavian and those who'd rather be a bit more American. So there really are choices that can be made. The second point is that I think it's an important distinction, and I'm not a philosopher to make, between what some people call procedural and what some people call distributive fairness. So procedural fairness is fairness in terms of the rules. And what I find interesting is actually people get much more hot onto the collar about that than they do about distributive fairness. So when you knock on people's doors, if you're canvassing or whatever it might be, they will say someone down the road is claiming benefits and they're not entitled to them. So actually that sense of fairness, that people aren't playing by the rules, is the thing that seems to kind of really get us going. Sadly, if you come from Will and my perspective, distributive fairness, whether, as it will, we allocate goods fairly around society, doesn't seem to get people going in quite the same way. And that takes me to my third point, which is that actually what interests me most and interests the RSA most is the question of what is it that underlies our desire to be fair? Why is it that we accord different levels of fairness to different members of society? And I think a big challenge is, if we're going to succeed in the kind of world we're moving into, how can we have greater empathy towards people who are very different to us? Because I think unless we have that capacity for empathy, then I think we're going to find it difficult to succeed in the world in which we're now moving into.
Do you think that capacity for empathy is more present in Scandinavian countries?
Well, I think it is, but I think that's a characteristic of those countries, which is they have tended to be more homogenous. They've tended to have a stronger religious code, which has greater sway throughout society. Certainly societies where there's a higher population turnover find fairness a more difficult thing. There is less solidarity in those societies.
And where do we sit at the moment, Matthew Taylor? Are we bang between the two stools, the Scandinavian and the American stool, or are we closer to one or the other?
We are currently slightly closer to the Scandinavian, and I don't say this is an attack upon the coalition, it's merely a description of what happens. We will, over the next 2 or 3 years, move closer to America. The evidence is that changes in social welfare spending, public spending as a whole, are 7 times as powerful as changes in GDP. So if your GDP goes up by 7%, but your social welfare spending goes down by 1%, then the poor end up in the same place.
I'm going to remind you of a classic episode of Blackadder, where Blackadder and Baldrick burn the dictionary overnight and then have to go and redefine all the words in the morning. They try and put it all together. And Baldrick, his task is to define the indefinite article, the word a. And he comes back and says, I've got the definition. It doesn't really mean anything. And I would have thought that the definition of fairness is something pretty much like that. It doesn't really mean anything. That's the truth of it. And certainly in modern political debate, when words are latched on by politicians and become the currency of our day-to-day discourse, this becomes doubly true. Fairness freedom, responsibility, a brighter future for our children, all of these sort of words, all the sort of things that no reasonable, rational human being could possibly be against. So I don't think the word is a particularly helpful one, actually, in our society anymore. But I think we can start to work out what it doesn't mean. It certainly doesn't mean an equality of outcome. We quite readily accept that different people will get different rewards through their lives. I don't think it even means an equality of opportunity. So if we're trying to struggle towards a definition, let's at least try and work out what unfairness might mean. And I think in terms of the overall term of the debate, a future fair for all, I'd like to just make a reference to the word future. Because if there is something that I think is grotesquely unfair in the United Kingdom at the moment, it is the enormous debt burden that people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and above are transferring to a younger generation. The cuts which are taking place in the United Kingdom at the moment have been directed disproportionately on those under the age of 50. Those, let's say, over the age of 60 have continually overseen governments that have put this country catastrophically in debt, quite irrespective of the global financial crisis. That is a bill that is going to be picked up by people who are not even old enough to vote yet.
What would be a more fair, or I suppose, to take you at your word, a less unfair way of meeting that bill? Because the bill is a given.
Well, I think that those who've had the benefits of it should be picking up the tab somewhat, whereas actually we are just delaying it.
More tax for people currently paying tax.
Or less benefits is the way round I'd look at it. I'd means test pensions, I'd certainly scrap universal benefits.
What you're espousing is essentially the notion that the people who've put the most into the pot previously have the least right to take anything out of it. But that sounds almost like a definition of unfairness in a sort of intuitive sense.
Yeah, it's interesting this. I think that I can't make my mind up about this one because I think there are two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, you could say that actually it's the affluent people in their 60s who most deserve the winter fuel allowance because they've paid their tax bill. They've probably contributed more than they've taken out, so let's only give it to the rich people. On the other hand, I would say let's split the two issues. Let's actually split poverty relief from actual handouts, benefits and government services. If we've got a problem with poverty, tackle that problem. Don't let the government run each and every service.
Well, I'm intrigued by how confident you are that there is a causal link between the have-nots and the haves, as it were. It seems that any analysis of fairness needs to presume on some level that the more him over there has, the less her over there will have. Can we be truly sure about that?
That's not how I think about fairness. And the way I think about fairness is whether it's deserved or not. It's not the deal to be born in a really disastrous part of Britain to disastrous parents of whom you have absolutely no control over your destiny. And in that sense, the have-not has really not deserved to be in the situation that they're in. It's unfair. There are some people who are very well off, and the example was given of a large mansion in Belgravia. It may be that someone's worked their socks off to get there and created tens of thousands of jobs, and done something enormously innovative that's transformed the world. And
who will decide? Who will decide, Will? Who's the one who's going to be in the court of law and decide you deserve your riches and you don't?
Well, this is the charge thrown at one by. This is the charge thrown at one, if I may say, by the right. I would say two things. First of all, not making that judgment is a bigger statement as making it. We live in a society. There are social norms. We expect reciprocal behaviour one from another. We want to trust and respect and be treated with dignity. And actually, we do make these judgments.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think it's good to have organisations where the people at the top earn hundreds of times as much as the people at the bottom? Forget your arguments about state action. I'm just asking you as a human being whether you are comfortable with living in a society where people who run organisations get paid hundreds, when it used to be tens as many times, they're now paid hundreds as many times.
It is not something that I relish or enjoy that there are very poor people. That bothers me more that there are poor people who have bad healthcare and bad education in this country than it bothers me that one is 100 times richer than another. It doesn't bother me that the people are 100 times richer than me. I don't care.
But if
What
you-
is
do you
important?
do you think there
What
might be
is
a- do you think there might be a
important
relationship
is
between the
the
two,
level
James?
of wealth of the poor.
Do you think there might be a relationship between the two?
We already have a situation where the rich are taxed at a much higher level, as a top 10% of rich people pay more than 50% of all taxation. People who benefits are the poor people. There's already redistribution going on a big scale. What you're saying is more. Whatever the level is, more.
Be careful not to let this debate sort of slide into a left-wing, right-wing false dichotomy here.
It already has.
This is a genuine philosophical question. The who decides. I agree that certain goods should be distributed according to need, but the who decides is important. Will talked about the voters deciding. Now that's a good starting point for some decisions, but children don't vote, and that's one of the problems why we're getting a lot of generational unfairness at the moment. There can be a tendency, not deliberately, but to overlook what children might want in this debate. This is not just a left-wing, right-wing decision.